Imagine you're a provincial court judge. You've been tasked with sentencing a person who committed a crime. So you've got to consider a huge list of things in the decision. You got to try and protect society, but you have to balance that against rehabilitating the offender or punishing the offender and a whole bunch of other things. And the way you see your job is going to have a huge effect on the liberty of some of the most vulnerable people in Canada. We need to be especially alive to the effect this process has on Indigenous peoples. And so this video is going to be about Indigenous criminal sentencing in Canada. All right, so this represents 100 people selected at random from the population of Canada. Those green people represent the proportion of Aboriginal people in Canada, about 4%. But now, if we represent the federal prisons, we get more than 28%. The problem only gets worse at the regional level. Aboriginal prisoners make up 26% of Newfoundland prisons, 30% of BC prisons, 39% of Alberta prisons, 74% of Manitoba prisons, and a whopping 76% of Saskatchewan prisons. And this problem's only been getting worse. Since 2006, the proportion of Aboriginal peoples in prison has been growing steadily. It's obvious this is a gigantic crisis, and it will take a lot of social change to fix it. But judges already have tools to change the tide of this crisis. Remember that big list of things that you had to consider when you were the provincial court judge? Well, in 1996, Parliament changed that list and added that judges had to consider all available sanctions other than imprisonment for Aboriginal offenders. What this requirement actually meant was decided in a landmark Supreme Court decision called Gladue. Basically, the court said that the purpose of adding that provision was to force judges to pay close attention to the unique circumstances of Aboriginal offenders. It meant that a judge had to have in front of him evidence of the offender's surrounding circumstances and use them as part of the sentence. The court clarified further, in more recent cases, that it meant judges have to consider the impacts of colonialism and that lawyers have a duty to get individualized reports in front of the judges. So how does this all work? Well, some of the factors considered in the Gladue report are going to decrease the blameworthiness of the offender in the mind of the judge. So, for example, in Gladue itself, the offender was a woman who was convicted of manslaughter for stabbing her boyfriend. So this young Aboriginal woman was part of an abusive relationship and she had childhood trauma, but the judge didn't take into consideration any of the young woman's past. He thought the law only applied to people who lived on reserve. So in setting him straight, the court's basically saying that these considerations are always going to apply to some extent, because the point of them is to address the overrepresentation crisis in prisons. Let's not forget that Parliament passed the law we've been talking about over 2 decades ago. Since that time, the proportion of Aboriginal people in Canada's prisons has almost doubled. There's still a limited reason to be optimistic, though. Judges who sentence Aboriginal people now can't ignore their Aboriginality anymore. Judges have to give reasons specific to the Aboriginal offender. Moving forward, there's going to be a lot of other ways the justice system needs to change to be consistent with reconciliation. Making Gladue reports more accessible and more prominent is only a very limited beginning.